If you're a rapper that feels like your rhymes are pretty good, but your lyrics are still lacking that extra power that's needed to really move the listener, then it's probably time for you to start focusing on harnessing the power of punchlines. In today's lesson, I'm going to be teaching you what punchlines are and 5 of the most effective techniques that rappers use to create punchlines that hit harder than Chris Brown did Rihanna, allegedly. So without further ado, let's get it! What's going on, everybody? It's your boy ColeMize with ColeMizeStudios.com, where it's my main aim to help you be a better rapper now. So what are punchlines? Simply put, punchlines is a line or a phrase or something that you say that has a heavy emotional impact on the listener. In hip hop, punchlines are often very funny or witty, but also they can be very deep and thought-provoking or just very obscene and inappropriate. And there's 2 main ways that we execute or deliver punchlines. The first one being what we call one-liners. One-liners is simply it's just a phrase, a really witty or a powerful, impactful phrase that only takes up 1 bar of a verse. Okay, this can be just a short phrase, doesn't have to be long. So for an example, in Field Mob's song, Where Are You Going? They say, low key like a midget locksmith, okay? And in Eminem's song 313, he says, you couldn't make the fans throw up their hands if they swallowed their fingers. And the second way that we deliver or execute punchlines is something I like to refer to as a build-up. These are punchlines that before they're said, there's typically several bars before them that are written in such a way that sets up that punchline so it has even more impact on the listener. For example, on Eminem's Nail in a Coffin, this is a diss track from back in the early 2000s, I believe, where he was going at Ray Benzino. Okay, and this is the some of the lines right here. I would never claim to be no Ray Benzino, an 83-year-old fake Pacino. So how can he hold me over some balcony without throwing his lower back out as soon as he goes to lift me? Please don't, you'll probably fall with me, and our butts will both be history. But then again, you'd finally get your wish because you'll be all over the street like 50 Cent. This is at a part where 50 Cent was just really hitting the scene. He was popping. And so that last line, because you'll be all over the street like 50 Cent, is the punchline. You know, it's somewhat of a double entendre because he's saying that you would literally splatter all over the street. But he's basically saying that's the only way that you would be all over the street like 50 Cent. And that's another phrase or slang which means like someone's really popular. They're all over the street. They're everywhere. They're well known, okay? And so that's a good example of a punchline that's set up before it's actually executed. And also for another example, on Eminem Fall, he says, and then tell the Grammys to go F themselves. They suck the blood from all the biggest artists like some leeches. So they nominate them, get them there, get a name to MC the show. Every parasite needs a host. So that last line, every parasite needs a host. Host is a simile because a host is also someone who MCs, right? MCs a show, like that's a host. Also a host is in reference to parasite. So it has a double meaning. And so that line is set up with the lines before it that really allow it to have more impact than it would if he just said that by himself. It has context. It has a lot more meaning than it would if it was just said by itself. Okay, now that you understand 2 of the main ways that we can execute or deliver punchlines, let's talk about the 5 most effective techniques that rappers use to create really hard-hitting punchlines. Okay, the first one is puns. A pun is when you use a word that sounds the same, but it can have 2 different meanings. For an example, let's say you have a family and there's a lot of you in your family. But let's say your family is also primarily kind of heavy set, okay? You could say that I have a big family, all right? And big could mean both. There's a lot of you, and big could also mean that you're also very heavy weight-wise. So like a lot of times in conversations, things like this will happen and we'll say like, no pun intended, but I have a big family. Now here's another example of a pun in a rap song. In Eminem's song, Love the Way You Lie, featuring Rihanna, he says, you don't get another chance. Life is no Nintendo game, but you lied again. Now you get to watch her leave. Out the window, guess that's why they call it window pane. So the word pain is the pun. Okay, pain is in P-A-I-N, like, oh, I'm hurt. And also pain, which is a part of a window pane. It has a pun to it. It means two different things, which apply in the context of what Eminem is saying right here. Okay, the second type of technique that we use is called similes. Okay, a simile is when you use one thing to compare to another thing. And this allows what you're trying to communicate to the listener to be a lot more dramatic or humorous or exaggerated. And it creates more of a visual in the mind of the listener oftentimes. And this is used a lot in teaching. Like, for an example, I may say, like, your rap flow is kind of like water, and just like how water can become whatever it is put inside, like a cup or a vase or whatever, it can become whatever it's put in. That's how your rap flow should be. It should be like water, like Bruce Lee said. And when using similes, you'll often use words such as like, or more than, or less than, etc. For example, inside the Prince's song Moving Around, he says, blow a bag of endo like a bad Nintendo. Okay, so if you don't know what that means, look, Nintendo games. All right, back in the day, we used to blow on them, okay, to make them work. And so blow is also kind of like a pun, because blow, you could think of it as literally physically blowing on a game, for an example, in this case. Or also the slang terminology, blow means to like run through something, like you ran through all your money, you blew all your money. Okay, so that's also a pun, but it's also a simile because he's saying like. So he's comparing two things together to create more of a visual. And for those 80s babies like myself out there, when he says like a bad Nintendo, it's going to put a visual in the mind of the listener. Another example is Ludacris's song Coming to America. He says, my rap career goes back further than your father's hairline. Okay, again, that's adding a nice comedic element to it. And it's also exaggerating, like, man, I've been rapping so long. I go back further than your father's receding hairline. So really good wordplay. Okay, the third type of technique that we use is something called double entendres. These are really, really prevalent, very, very popular when it comes to hip hop. You've heard them a lot, most likely, if you've been listening to a lot of hip hop. And basically a double entendre is similar in a sense to a pun, to where it can be something that has two meanings. But in this case, it's not just limited to like one word having double meanings. This could be an entire phrase that can have double or sometimes even multiple triple meanings. And typically in double entendres, you'll have one meaning that's a lot more obvious and the other meaning's a lot less obvious. So for an example, this can be used a lot in, let's say, children's cartoons or like Pixar movies where the audience is for children, but adults are still watching. So they want to put like jokes and stuff in there that only adults will get. So it's more subtle. But also like in hip hop, this can just be a way to where you're making multiple things, multiple points by saying one phrase, and it can mean multiple things, which really has a major impact on the listener. And it really can have that wow factor if it's pulled off correctly. Let me give you an example of one of those. So for an example, Drake's song Back to Back, where him and Meek Mill was going at it, he says, you love her, then you got to give the world tour. Is that a world tour or your girl's tour? I know that you got to be a thug for her. This ain't what she meant when she told you to open up more. Whew, man, that's a good dig. So told you to open up more. When he says this ain't what she meant when she told you to open up more, he's referring to saying that he was opening up for Nicki Minaj on tour, saying, is that your tour or is that your girl's tour, right? He's saying basically you're opening up for your girlfriend, and he's saying I don't think that's what she meant when she said she wants you to open up more. So opening up is a slang term for people who are on tour. You have different acts, you have the main act, and then people who come before that main act could be considered openers. They're usually not as popular. So that's a really good dig at Meek Mill, saying basically your girlfriend is way more popular than you are, and so you're opening up for her on tour. And it has a double meaning because he's saying I don't think that's what she meant when she said she wants you to open up more, like in a relationship, like share your emotions, be a lot more affectionate and sensitive to how you feel and express that to me. So that's a really, really good dig. And another, once again, this punchline isn't a one-liner because he's setting it up which allows that to have a lot more impact when he says that last line. This ain't what she meant when she told you to open up more. Very, very well executed. Okay, the fourth type of technique that we'll use to create really good punchlines is known as metaphors. Metaphor is a figure of speech that we use to describe something in a very dramatic way, typically, that's not literally or physically possible to happen. This is a way that we make things a lot more dramatic, to exaggerate things and make them bigger than they may actually be. And it really adds a lot of color, and also can really add a lot more of a visual, once again, in the mind of the listener. And as you can see, like these different techniques, it's almost a way to paint, a lot of times, paint things in the mind of the listener in such a way to where it's like you suck them in and they can almost see a lot of the things that you're talking about. And it just makes things a lot more real to them, like you're sucking them into like a real world that you've created with your words. And so, for an example, with a metaphor, Joyner Lucas in his song Devil's Work, he said, drowning in my tears, trying to pray for something. So drowning in my tears, that's a metaphor. Drowning, it's physically impossible to drown in your own tears. So that's saying, like, that's how much I'm hurting. That's how much I'm crying to the point where I'm drowning in my own tears. Another example of this is Eminem's song called Haley's Song. He said, because there's a lot of ish I keep bottled that hurts deep inside of my soul. And just know that I grow colder the older I grow. This boulder on my shoulder gets heavy and harder to hold. And this load is like the weight of the world, and I think my neck is breaking. So there's a lot of metaphors in there. For an example, I keep this bottled deep inside of my soul. Like I'm taking something, putting it in a container, and I'm tucking it into my soul. That's a metaphor. I grow colder the older I grow, so that's a metaphor as well. And boulder, this boulder on my shoulder, right? Like think about a boulder as a humongous rock. And he's saying, forget like a chip on my shoulder. That's another metaphor, but this is an exaggeration, a boulder on my shoulder, right? And it's getting harder to hold. And then he says, I feel like the weight of the world, right? This load is like the weight of the world. So the entire earth is on his shoulders. That's a huge exaggeration, right? Physically impossible to carry that much weight. You would be squashed. So a lot of metaphors going on there in that example. Okay, the fifth technique that we'll use to create punchlines is something called irony. Okay, and irony basically is when you give the listener something that they least expect, or it's almost contrary or opposite of what was expected, right? So for an example, and this is a real life example, when I was in high school, I remember our shop teacher was giving us safety lessons on how to use like the circular saw. And while he's giving us safety tips, he cut his finger off. That's ironic, right? That's not supposed to happen, right? You're giving me safety tips and you cut your finger off. That's what you call irony. Like, wow, how ironic was that? Here's an example in rap. In Chino XL's song called Creep, he says, as far as that album you dropped, I ain't feeling it. I wouldn't buy your record if it had $100 bill in it. That's ironic because an album only costs somewhere between like $10 and like $17 when we used to buy them in stores. So who wouldn't buy an album that had $100 bill in it? You're basically printing money. That's very ironic, so that's a dig at like, that's how bad your album is. I wouldn't even buy it if it had $100 bill in it. So irony can be used to create humor, make something just ridiculous. And here's a bonus tip for you, a bonus technique that you can use, and that's shock value. Okay, Tekashi 69 has this one down pat, but basically it's just when you say something that's super stupid, super ridiculous, surprising, shocking, offensive, inappropriate, embarrassing. It can be something that's like super embarrassing, that's like leaves the listener saying like, I cannot believe he or she just said that. So one example of that is Ja Rule, Loose Change. I won't never forget this. This is when him and Eminem was going back and forth quite a few years ago now. But I won't never forget when I heard this line, my jaw literally dropped, and I was like, I cannot believe that he went there and said that. So, it's a diss track at Eminem from Ja Rule targeting Eminem, and the very last line Once again, this is a line that's at the very end of a song. So just as I've been teaching you about like setups, like the two different types of punchlines, right? You have one-liners and you have ones that you can set up or build up to execute them or deliver them. On this one, he has a punchline at the very end of the song. So like his whole song is leading up to this one line, and then he just leaves you like, boom, drops mic, walks off the stage. But this is what he says. He says, "Shut up, M. You claim your mother's a crackhead and Kim's a known slut. So what's Haley gonna be when she grows up?" Oh my goodness. When I heard that, I was like, wow, I cannot believe he said that. You know, like, I know the whole point in rap beef is to go at each other and just be super disrespectful. But you wonder sometimes, like, man, are there rules to this? Like, is there a such thing as going a little bit too far? Like bringing people's children into the mix and stuff like that? So when I heard that, I was like, I cannot believe Ja Rule said that. So shock value. That's another way that you can create a punchline that has a lot of impact on the listener. So let's do a quick recap. A punchline is simply a line that you say that has a heavy emotional impact on the listener. There's two main methods that we use to deliver or execute punchlines. That's one-liners, which is just using one line or one phrase just to say the punchline. And then we have build-ups, and build-ups allow us to set up a punchline by using several bars before we deliver that punchline, or even in Ja Rule's case, it could be an entire song or an entire verse before you deliver that punchline. And that allows it to have a lot more impact. And then the 6 techniques that rappers use to create really hard-hitting punchlines. These are also known as literary devices. So all the things that I've been teaching today, these are also what we call wordplay or literary devices. And so the first one is puns, which is a single word that has the same sound but 2 meanings. Number 2, a simile, which is when you use one thing to compare to another, which makes things a lot more relatable and visual to the mind of the listener. Number 3, double entendre, when you express several meanings within one phrase. Typically, one of those meanings is way more obvious and the other one's more subtle. Number 4, metaphors. Metaphors are a figure of speech. Typically, it's something that we say in such a way to where we exaggerate and blow something out of proportion to make it a lot more interesting to the listener. And typically, the way that we describe these metaphors is physically impossible, such as boulders on my shoulders, or I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. Number 5, irony. Okay, irony is when you say something that's contrary, the opposite of what a person expects. It can come off as being ridiculous and humorous. And bonus tip number 6 is shock value. Saying something that's completely inappropriate, ridiculous, embarrassing, something that the audience cannot believe that you just said, is another great way to have a lot of impact on the listener and really move them in a powerful and emotional way. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Take one of the 6 literary devices or the techniques that I just shared with you of how we write punchlines. Pick one of them and try to write a punchline using that technique in the comments section below. And if you're new to my channel, I have a gift I would love to hook you up with. It's an ebook that I wrote called The #1 Fundamental to Rapping. And it's a great tool if you're someone new to rapping, or you've already been rapping for a few years, but you're still kind of struggling to see the results and really wrap your mind around how this whole thing works. This is a tool that I wish I would have had when I first started off rapping. And it's something that you can consume within a very short period of time. It's really easy to read, and it's really going to give you a grasp on how this whole rapping thing works. And it's going to share with you what I believe to be the #1 fundamental to rapping. And if you apply that #1 fundamental to your rapping, it's going to make everything you do as a rapper so much more entertaining and enjoyable to the listener, to where you can keep them hooked the entire time they're listening to you, and you'll still leave them wanting more. Again, my name is ColeMize with ColeMizeStudios.com. And always remember, when it comes to rapping, there's no rules. There's only techniques. Peace. Hey man, you see that subscribe button right there? Kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. Oh, and don't forget the bell icon. Kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. Hey, I know you see that like button, right? Kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it, kill it. And look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself, today I'm gonna kill it.